So, as was mentioned, pipes are now packets, part 2. What you really need to know about QC monitoring and maintenance for IP systems. My name's Kevin Salvidge. I'm the Sales Engineering and Technical Marketing Manager for Leader, based in London in the UK. So a question for you. IP sounds great. So how difficult can it be? To understand IP, let's just take a quick look at the fundamental differences between SDI and IP. IP content arrives continuously. It's synchronous, deterministic, and it's well behaved. And it's great from going from point A to point B. IP content arrives in packets, and packets arrive when packets arrive. So this is okay for small processes like email, spreadsheets, Word documents, but it does give us a challenge when we come to live TV production. As I mentioned, SDI arrives continuously and traffic flows are constant. We've gone from 1.5G to 3G to 6G to 12G. The only thing we've needed to worry about is the quality of the road, the cables, the connectors, and the distance that we're sending these signals over. With IP, as I mentioned, packets arrive when they arrive. The difference here is we know the road is good. We've got a 25 gig wide pipe. We may even have a wider pipe. We now need to worry about traffic congestion. Fortunately, SMPTE have done a lot of work on this, and we've implemented standards. Part of the 2110 suite, -21, the professional media over managed IP networks, traffic shaping and delivery timing for video. So with current broadcast formats, video must arrive frame synchronous at the camera sensor and at the viewer's television screen. And as I mentioned, SDI is nice and controlled, so we've not really had to worry about congestion. But the intermediate IP distribution network is asynchronous, but the variance in packet jitter directly affects latency, leading to potentially longer video and audio delays than we have come to expect with SDI infrastructures. And if we don't cater for these, we have quality of service issues. So let's take a look at a packet's journey from that camera sensor to the viewer's television set at home. The sender, it's going to travel through the 7 layers of the OSI model. It's going to travel through a network switch. Then, when it reaches the receiver, it goes through the 7 layers of the OSI model again. What could possibly go wrong? There's at least 15 layers of processing going on there. Each one of those has the potential to affect the transfer of the packets, to add jitter, to cause delay. As I mentioned, SMPTE 2110-21 has done a lot of work to give us some rules to follow on this and defining the packet delivery timing characteristics as they leave the transmission interface of the sender. And there are 3 models that we commonly look at using. The first of those is what's referred to as narrow gapped, where we send the active video, then there is the vertical interval which is blank or a gap, and then we have the next field or line of video. And as you can see, this gives us a small bitrate variation. This is typically how most hardware senders work. But obviously, one of the advantages of moving to the world of IP is that we can start to utilize technology from other disciplines, other IT-centric worlds. We can simplify the transmission by going to what we call narrow linear. So now the gap has moved and the packet spacing has been equaled up. And as you can see now, we have a very small bit rate variation. But the big benefit is to start to use software devices in our infrastructures, which means we don't have to keep replacing them every time new features, new functionality, new technical demands hit us. We can reprogram the FPGAs and they can handle the new requirements. But this does mean that we're looking at what's known as a wide sender. And this has a lot larger bitrate variance. 2110 talks a lot about -20 being the active video. So this is only the picture. But in the SDI world, we've been familiar with horizontal and vertical blanking, which was the home for Hank and Vank data, where we basically put lots of useful information that was associated with the picture. This is the bit that I always find amusing. Here we are talking about IP and 2110, and I'm going to start off with an analog waveform. But it's a very clear and easy way for you to see that -20 talks about just the active video. And you can see on here the components that we are actually using as part of our -20 stream. As I mentioned, it talks about only the active video. So let's take a look at how this affects what's going on. And we'll start off with our narrow gapped sender. So this now means that the packets are sent. There is a gap where the vertical interval would have existed in the world of SDI video. So obviously we have to tell the systems receiving where we are in the cycle. And we use a marker bit to indicate it's the end of the field or frame of video. And then we have what's known as the first active pixel to indicate the start of the next line. So these are quite important and they're very key timing references as we move forward. So a narrow gapped sender will send packets in nice groups with a gap. Our buffer will receive those and regulate the flow so that we get no quality of service issues. If we now move to the narrow linear, as you'll see, the packets are now evenly spread, very similar to SDI video. And again, the buffer stores them, regulates the flow, and we have no quality of service issues. When we move to the wide sender, we need to increase the size of the buffer. And obviously that has a financial impact. So this is something that we need to be careful of. Yes, the devices can be upgraded very easily via software, but it does mean that the receiving devices have to have a buffer large enough to accommodate them. So now we get the large packet rate variation coming in, but fortunately we've sized the buffer correctly so that we don't lose any packets. That's how it works in a perfect world. But we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a world of broadcast where we have to anticipate the most unexpected thing happening at the most inopportune moment. So you'll hear this term called overflow error. And what that means is that basically the packets arriving have filled the buffer. And those packets are lost. And if those packets are lost, we get no picture. So that's a term you're going to see quite a lot, overflow error. The next term is underflow error. And this is where the buffer becomes starved. It's emptied. It doesn't have any data to process. So again, we lose our picture. And this is referred to as an underflow error. So those are the three parameters that SMPTE 2110-21 talks about: narrow gapped, narrow linear, and wide. Fortunately, there is also a SMPTE 2110-25 recommended practice, which then talks about how you measure these parameters associated with the timing, and that's what we're going to look at now. So 2110-25, there are three main areas of this particular recommended practice. It's not a standard, it's a recommended practice. The first of those is network burstiness. Lovely description. I speak English as my first language. I dread to think, if English is not your first language, what network burstiness means. Virtual receiver buffers, how the device receiving the packets is going to behave, and the timing of those messages. How are we doing on those being sent? So let's take a look at the first one. So network compatibility model, and here we have, this allows you to test directly at the output of the sender. So packets from the sender enter a buffer that drain at a regular interval, and these packets can come in at various rates. I'm hoping, and as they leave the buffer, they are nice and evenly spaced. And as you can see now, the buffer fills and empties, but it never overflows and it doesn't run a void. So these are referred to as your C-inst, which is the instantaneous value in the buffer, and C-max. This is the maximum size that the buffer can accommodate. If we take this further, we can see now that this is running quite happily. And to give you an indication of the number of packets, what we refer to as VRX full is going to be 8 packets minimum for a narrow sender, which is approximately 2 lines of data if you're running 422 1920 by 1080. And for VR full in a wide sender, we're looking around about 720 packets, which is 20% of a 422 1920 by 1080 frame. So as you design your systems, if you have one wide sender in your infrastructure and you want every receiver to be able to analyze, decode and present the information from that sender, they have to be wide receivers. That is the rules, because if they're not, you're going to have an overflow error because the buffer is not big enough, it's going to flood and you're going to lose packets. So if that's the case, as you'll see in this animation here, packets start arriving, and once the buffer's empty, we can't make them up. They don't get resent, they're gone forever. So you've got to bear this in mind. And you'll see the message VRX overflow has occurred whenever the value of the VRX peak exceeds the VRX full. And you will see it report the number of packets that have been discarded. So it will give you an idea of how ineffective your system is. Latency. IP is all about timing, knowing when something was sent, knowing when something arrived, and we do this by using PTP. So we have every device that sends, each packet has what we call an RTP timestamp, and that is originated from PTP. So you'll have PTP as your reference across the whole system so that we can realign packets as they travel across the network based upon their RTP timestamp. So the first of those we're going to look at is what's called latency. And the video latency measurements is the difference between the arrival time of the first packet of a frame and the time encoded in the RTP timestamp of that packet. So it's when it left the sender to when it arrives at the receiver. And tools that will display this in graphical form are out there and available. So that's what they mean. You're expecting to see a nice linear flat line to indicate that you've got a constant latency throughout your system. You will also see mentioned the RTP offset. And this is the difference between the time encoded in the RTP timestamp and the PTP epoch aligned start time of the frame of video. So we've now got a very accurate measurement of the particular packets. And again, if that's working correctly, you should see a nice graph, and that should be a nice flat line based around 0 to mean that you've got no timing issues. And the final graph in this particular section is the RTP timestamp frequency offset measurement. And this can be used to gauge whether the sender's media clock is running too fast or too slow compared to the PTP time of the receiver. This is telling you that your network sending device's reference does not correspond to your receiver, and you're either sending stuff too fast or too slow. So again, this is where you should be looking at having PTP if you're using a wide area network environment running. So as you've gathered, the first packet arrival time is quite critical because it's the first piece of active video to hit your receiver. So when we did SDI video, we normally start at black on line 0, pixel 0. But obviously, in the world of 2110, we're dealing with active video, and I mentioned this earlier. So we now start here, where in an analog world would have been start of active video. So tools like test and measurement products will give you graphs that we used in the world of SDI video, but now we're looking at them in IP. So here we have an indication that the vertical phase and horizontal phase are starting at 0. And this is telling me this is PTP to black and burst phase that I'm measuring here, because I'm probably going to be working in a hybrid environment with both SDI and IP sources. And as I mentioned, the marker bit indicates either the last line or the last field of video. So as we're only working with active video, there is going to be a vertical phase offset. And if you're working with a 1080i signal, that's going to be around 20 or 21 lines. If you're working with a progressively scanned image, it's going to be 42. Remember those numbers because they're really useful. If you see that sort of offset, you know what signals being sent and you're expected to receive. So here is our first packet. Indication that it's 20 lines offset. And it's telling me up there that I'm measuring PTP to RTP phase. So as I mentioned there, my first packet in old language is start of active video, and my marker bit is end of active video. So these are quite critical. So the first packet time is equivalent to video start, analog or SDI. And since the first packet of a frame generally comes from the start of the active region, the first packet is delayed by the vertical blanking period as compared to the traditional V0 timing, which I showed on the previous graphic. FTP measurements arrive time of the first packet of a frame is relative to what's known as the alignment time. And this is defined by SMPTE ST2059-1 of the corresponding frame in an SDI signal. This measurement is taken using the receiver's reference time for the actual arrival time. The range of the measurement will be plus or minus 1/2 of one frame period relative to the current frame time, and shall be expressed in microseconds. And again, you'll see tester measurement tools now that will give you graphs demonstrating the trend of that line over a period of time. The next piece that it talks about is the first packet time margin. So to understand the margin, let's have a look at the receiver. And many of you have probably studied the 2110-21 document and seen this graph and thought, whoa, that's a bit of a head wreck. So let's try and explain what it's doing. You've actually got three graphs here. The top one is detailing that packets arrive at the receiver. The next graph says when the packets leave the receiver. So remember I said they arrive, they're going to go through the 7 layers of the OSI model and they're going to be processed before they leave. That takes time. And that will vary from receiver to receiver. So you need to be aware of that in your calculations when you come to design IP systems. And the final piece at the bottom is what we call the virtual receiver buffer. And what this tells you is how many packets are actually in the buffer. So I start receiving them, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then my first packet leaves. So I'm now down to 3. Then another packet comes in, I'm back up to 4. Then one leaves, I'm back to 3. One comes in, I'm back to 4. So this is what the virtual receiver is telling you, is how many packets are physically in the buffer. So you want to make sure that your virtual receiver can manage and it doesn't lose packets, basically with an overflow error. So here we have the active pixels. And as you can see, the margin is the difference between when the first packet arrived and when the first packet left the device. So that's what's known as first packet time margin. And there is our first packet arriving. As you can see, it enters the device and that's when it's ready to leave the sender. And again, you will see some lovely graphs that can show the trends of these, whether they're going up or down. Because what you'll find with IP networks, they don't typically drop off a cliff and fail. You'll see them gradually creeping up and latency increasing, or you'll gradually see them tailing off. So having tools like this, which give you a graphical view of all the flows. So I've just been talking about video, but obviously first packet time is applicable to the audio, it's applicable to the ancillary data. Having graphs that you can see how the network's performing, like we can see here. See the spike on the virtual receiver? It suddenly got more packets in it than, should we say, I was probably expecting. So there's a lot to this. Hopefully in the last 25 minutes I've simplified it and you get the basic principle of what's going on. If you want to see more on these products, I am here at the show on the Leader PHABRIX booth in the Central Hall. And if you'd like a copy of the presentation, there is a link here to the QR code that you'll be able to download it from. My name's Kevin Salvidge. I'm based in London, so out of the European office. My colleague, Steve Holmes, so if you're here in the US, you may well know Steve already. And if you have any questions on that, please don't hesitate to ask me. That would have been embarrassing if I do a talk about timing and I overran. So thank you very much, everybody.
You're doing just fine. Any questions?